Elden Ring just received a big update that adds some very nice quality of life changes, some missing quest steps for certain NPC storylines, but it also nerfed some of the most powerful weapons, summons and attacks in the game. We'll tell you everything you need to know about update 1.3 in this video, so let's get right into it. So the big news here is that both the Hoarfrost Stomp weapon art and the Sword of Night and Flame have been nerfed. We'll talk about the sword in a bit, but the Hoarfrost Stomp weapon art has decreased damage and increased cast time according to the patch notes. And yeah, after testing them, both of these are definitely noticeable when trying the skill with the patch downloaded. The damage of the first hit of the ice crystals is a bit lower, but it's mostly the delayed explosion that deals way less damage, going from 500 to 169 on the same enemy before and after the patch. The increased cast time is mostly something you notice near the end of the animation, as you linger a lot longer than before the patch. This means it takes longer for your next action to come out when you use this ability, so you can't spam it as much as before. Still, it's a very useful Ash of War to have. The attack is still pretty good because it builds up the Frostbite status effect, and so does your weapon if you choose to when applying the Ash of War. It's just not as game breaking as before the patch. And the same can be said for the Sword of Night and Flame, which we made a video on how to get, so go watch that one if you haven't already. But yeah, as we can see here in the patch notes, FromSoft have decreased weapon skill Sword of Night and Flame's damage. In case you didn't know, the Sword of Night and Flame's weapon art allows you to enter a stance that can fire off two different magical attacks, a magical beam of light and a wall of fire, which both used to deal an absurd amount of damage. But the patch changed some things for this weapon, right Jordan?
Yeah, for sure. First I could easily nuke most of the health bar for one of the knights in the first legacy dungeon, but as you can see here, I deal way less damage after the update while still hitting the full beam. The heavy attack variant has also been nerfed to where I would first do around the 600 damage against an early game giant. I now deal 359. Like sure, you can still easily kill smaller enemies in one shot, still very satisfying. It's just mostly that using the beam or fire against higher health targets is way less powerful after the patch. And also if we put the item cards from before the update and after the update next to each other, we actually see that the FP cost for these attacks has also been increased by quite a lot. So overall, Sword of Night and Flame has seen a significant nerf. Now something I also tested is the damage for all the offensive cracked pot items. You can of course make them after buying the crafting kit. And yes, I did notice quite the increase in one of the tests. Here I did 88 against this early game soldier. And after the update, same fire pot, same enemy, I did 146. So there's totally more incentive to throw these. You can also craft the Roa Raisin to heal your mount, and they now increased the effectiveness of this. When you die, your mount will still have the same amount of health as before. First, the berries would not really heal a lot. Now after the update, I totally needed less berries to heal Torrent to full health again.
Alright, thanks Jordan. Before we touch on some more changes to spells in particular, as a lot have actually been buffed here, let's first look at a really nice quality of life change. Now you might have noticed this already after exploring with the new patch, but it's now much easier to find merchants and NPCs on the map, because they now have dedicated icons on the map with their names next to it. And this is all added retroactively, so any NPC or merchant you've encountered before the patch should be visible on your map straight away. I love this change, it makes keeping track of NPC quests and locations of specific merchants so much easier. And speaking of quests, turns out some NPCs in the game had some missing dialogue, as the patch notes also mention that the developers have added new quest phases for the following NPCs: Dialos, Nefeli Lu, Kenneth Hyde and Gatekeeper Gostok. So if you've encountered any of these before but were stuck on their quest, go talk to them again to see if you can make more progress now. There's even a new NPC with a quest of their own, Jarbairn, located in the Liurna region. This adorable little pole person can be found in Jarburg over here on the map. You need to do a little bit of platforming to get down next to this giant tower, but then you will eventually reach a grace point at the bottom and of course our new best friend Jarbairn. And on the note of friends, this patch also introduced nerfs to a spirit summon that a lot of people, including myself have grown to love a lot, the Mimic tier. This Spirit Ash lets you summon a copy of yourself, which includes your current armor, weapon, and array of spells. So, depending on your build, this spirit could be insanely powerful, as it can effectively pull off all the moves that you can. Patch 1.3 decreased the damage on this Mimic tier, as well as supposedly changing its behavior. Not sure what has been changed there, as my Mimic was still able to run into a fight and draw aggro and even use weapon art, so pretty much everything you'd expect from it. I did notice the decrease in damage though, although I have to say that it still packs a pretty big punch. Now this might be because I've upgraded my summon to a pretty high level, but it does show you that the Mimic tier can still be really useful, it's just not as overpowered as it used to be. But it's not all nerfs this patch though, far from it actually, as a lot of spells have been rebalanced. Glintstone Comet Shard, Comet and Night Comet all had their FP cost reduced and damage increased, and the damage is increased as well for the spells Gravity Well, Collapsing Stars and Crystal Barrage. We tested that last one to see if the damage had changed, and the difference is indeed very noticeable. Here, before the patch, I had trouble taking out this group of really weak enemies with Crystal Barrage, but after the patch we see the spell deal significant damage against a stronger enemy and even against a boss. And it was already a fun spell to use, but now that this Crystal Machine Gun actually packs decent damage too, I think I'm going to be using it a lot more. If you by the way want to get it, you can get it from the NPC Salon in the Waypoint Ruins over here on the map. You go down the stairs over here, at the bottom of it will be a boss, but he's not too difficult, and then after you defeat him, you can open the door on the other end of the room to find an NPC that is willing to sell you spells. We also tried out the Gravity Well after the patch, and while the damage isn't bad, it falls off really quickly against targets with higher health and is mostly useful for crowd control, as it also draws an enemy towards you if you hit them. But yeah, even after the patch, the damage part is kind of lacking in my opinion, but of course if you're dealing tons of damage with the spell after the update, let us know in the comments below. There's also a big list of spells that had their FP cost reduced. For the full list, go check the patch notes, we'll leave a link to them in the video description, but one in particular I wanted to highlight was Loretta's Great Bow. This is a powerful spell you get from the main boss of the Caria Manor dungeon, but the main thing holding it back was the fact that it costs a lot of FP to cast. And it still kinda does, as the FP cost has been reduced from 32 to 28, but it's still very nice to be able to use this spell more often, even if the change probably only amounts to an extra shot per FP bar. Another thing that was buffed with this update was the drop rate for smithing stones, so the material you need to upgrade your weapons. These can drop from specific enemies, like these Godric soldiers you find in a lot of places, but at least in my experience they wouldn't drop them very often. But the drop rates for this item have now been buffed, so you should see them drop a lot more. I tried this at the Gatefront Ruins near the start of the game, where there are a lot of these Godric soldier enemies, and in my 3 runs farming the camp I found smithing stones on 2 of them, which definitely feels like an increase from what it was before. So you can farm this material in this camp and the other locations, but there's also a different way of getting these precious upgrade materials, which we discussed in a previous video. The short version is that there's an item that just lets you buy them, which I think is still a faster and easier way of getting these items. And there have been some changes in terms of weapons too. For starters, the patch has increased shield's effectiveness. Not exactly sure what part of the effectiveness has been increased, as the patch notes don't mention that, although I don't remember being able to block the tree sentinel this often without losing stamina. And a lot of the fixes this patch also look at weapon scaling. For if you don't know, each weapon scales part of its damage with your stats, and you can check which weapon scales with which stats on the item card over here. In the patch notes we see fix the bug that causes Arcane to scale incorrectly for some weapons, so that concerns weapons that use the Arcane stat for damage scalings, like the Reduvia dagger or Eleonora's pole blade. The patch notes also mention fixed a bug which causes some weapons to have incorrect scaling after strengthening, so upgrading them, and fixed a bug which causes some weapons to not use stat scaling. Again, hard to know which weapons this affects, as the patch notes do not mention it, but if your current weapon suddenly deals a lot more damage after the patch, now you know why. We also got a slight change to the Bloody Slash Ash of War. This special move lets you perform a quick and powerful slash that costs a bit of your own health to use. And while it still does all of these things, the patch has increased Bloody Slash self-inflicted damage while slightly lowering the damage of the ability and increasing the cast time. You'll mostly notice the increase in self-inflicted damage, as I didn't really notice a huge change in the casting time or in the damage. So this means that the ability is still pretty strong, you just have to watch your own health carefully while using it. Also, a bit of an unexpected change, but this update removed an armor set from the game. Now I personally never found this ragged set, but FromSoft note that they have deleted the ragged armor set from the game, which was mistakenly obtainable in a previous patch. And then there's also fixes for a bug that sometimes prevented the player from obtaining items after a boss battle, as well as a bug that causes the player to freeze when riding. More nice bug fixes include a fix for a bug that prevented the player from moving to the next area after the battle with the fire giant, which is a pretty significant progression blocker, so it's really nice to see that fixed. And even more weapons and enemies have their damage numbers adjusted, as the patch also notes other enemy and weapon balance changes. That's all for the biggest changes of the update though. Remember to leave a like if you liked the video, and you can of course subscribe as well if you don't want to miss our next Elden Ring video. You can also watch our previous video on some amazing armor sets you can already get very early in the game. For now, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye!